Welcome. Today we look back at one of the most defining events in human history, World War II. This was a conflict that reshaped nations, transformed societies, and changed the role of the United States in the world forever. What follows is not a story of heroes and villains alone, but a record of decisions, sacrifices, and consequences that continue to shape our present. This is the story of World War II. Inside the steel coffin. For American tank crews in World War II, war was not fought in open air. It was fought inside a metal box filled with noise, heat, smoke, and fear. Infantry could dive into foxholes. Pilots could bail out. Tank crews had neither option. When a tank was hit, survival depended on seconds, teamwork, and luck. Most American tankers entered the war with little understanding of what armored combat truly meant. Training taught them how to drive, shoot, and maintain their vehicles. But it could not prepare them for the reality of being sealed inside a moving target. The first time enemy fire struck armor, the sound alone was terrifying. A violent, ringing impact that shook the entire vehicle and sent shock waves through every crewman's body. American tank doctrine emphasized mobility, reliability, and coordination, rather than sheer firepower. The M4 Sherman became the backbone of U.S. armored forces. It was not the most heavily armored tank on the battlefield, nor the most powerful. But it was dependable, fast, and easy to repair. For tank crews, this meant something critical. If a tank was damaged, it might be fixed. If it was destroyed, another would arrive. Survival was built into the system, even if individual moments were deadly. Life inside a tank was brutal. Space was limited. Crewmen operated inches from each other, surrounded by ammunition and fuel. Engines roared constantly. Communication relied on shouted commands or intercoms that often failed under fire. The smell of oil, sweat, and cordite became permanent. After hours inside the tank, men emerged exhausted, ears ringing, clothes soaked. The tank commander's role was especially dangerous. He often stood partially exposed in the turret to observe the battlefield. This gave him visibility, but made him vulnerable to snipers, machine gun fire, and shell fragments. Many commanders were killed in seconds. Those who survived learned to balance awareness with survival instinct. Early encounters with German armor were sobering. In North Africa and later in Europe, American tankers faced enemy vehicles with heavier guns and thicker armor. German tanks like the Panther and Tiger could destroy Shermans at long range. American crews learned quickly that standing still meant dying. Movement, coordination, and numbers mattered more than individual duels. Tank combat was fast and unforgiving. Engagements often lasted minutes, sometimes seconds. A single penetrating hit could turn a tank into an inferno. Ammunition cooked off. Fuel ignited. Crewmen had to escape instantly, or not at all. Fire drills were practiced obsessively, because panic killed faster than flames. Despite these dangers, American tank crews adapted. They learned to fight alongside infantry, using foot soldiers to protect tanks from close-range threats, while tanks provided fire support. Artillery and air support were integrated to compensate for disadvantages in armor and gunpowder. Victory came through combined arms, not tank versus tank heroics. For tank crews, courage was not dramatic. It was routine. It was climbing back into a tank after watching another burn. It was advancing down a road known to be covered by enemy guns. It was trusting the men beside you in a space where one mistake could kill everyone. The tank was both weapon and trap. It offered protection and promised death if that protection failed. This was armored warfare as American tank crews lived it. Loud, cramped, violent, and relentless. And this was only the beginning. First battles, North Africa, and learning the cost of armor. American tank crews first entered large-scale combat in North Africa, and the desert became their harsh classroom. Wide-open terrain offered long lines of sight, little cover, and brutal lessons. Here, armor was exposed, mistakes were punished instantly, and survival depended on learning faster than the enemy. In 1942 and early 1943, U.S. armored units were inexperienced and often poorly coordinated. Crews were still learning how to fight as teams rather than as individual vehicles. Radios were unreliable. Communication between tanks, infantry, and artillery was inconsistent. German armored forces, hardened by years of combat, exploited these weaknesses with precision. Early engagements revealed painful truths. American Shermans were outgunned by German anti-tank weapons and heavier armor. German gunners waited at long range, striking Shermans before American crews even saw where the fire came from. Tanks burned quickly. Crews bailed out under fire, sometimes leaving wounded comrades behind because stopping meant death for everyone. The Battle of Kasserine Pass became a defining moment. American armored units were pushed back by coordinated German attacks. Confusion reigned. Orders conflicted. Tanks advanced without infantry support and were destroyed in isolation. The defeat was humiliating, but it was also transformative. After Kasserine, changes came fast. Leadership was replaced where necessary. Training intensified. Doctrine shifted. Tank crews were taught never to fight alone. Infantry support became mandatory. Artillery was integrated into every armored advance. Tank commanders learned to read terrain, to anticipate ambushes, and to withdraw without hesitation when the situation demanded it. North Africa also taught tank crews about maintenance and endurance. Desert conditions punished machinery relentlessly. Sand clogged engines and weapons. Heat exhausted crews rapidly. Tanks required constant attention to remain operational. Crewmen became mechanics by necessity, fixing engines and tracks under fire or at night to be ready for the next day. Psychologically, North Africa hardened American tankers quickly. Watching tanks burn left lasting impressions. Crews learned to identify the smell of burning fuel and ammunition instantly. Fire drills were repeated until movement became automatic. Seconds mattered. Hesitation meant being trapped inside a burning hull. Yet improvement was visible. As American tank crews adapted, their effectiveness increased. Coordinated advances replaced reckless charges. Smoke was used to conceal movement. Artillery suppressed enemy guns before tanks moved forward. Losses remained high, but they were no longer pointless. By the end of the North African campaign, American tank crews were no longer raw. They had learned how quickly armored warfare punished arrogance and rewarded discipline. They had learned that no tank was invulnerable, and that survival depended on cooperation, not courage alone. North Africa did not make American tank crews confident. It made them realistic. And that realism would save lives when they crossed into Europe, where the fighting would be closer, more complex, and even more deadly. Normandy. Tanks in the hedgerows. When American tank crews landed in Normandy in the summer of 1944, they entered a battlefield that punished every habit learned in North Africa. The open desert was gone. In its place stood the hedgerows, thick earthen banks topped with dense vegetation that divided the countryside into thousands of small enclosed fields. For armor, this terrain was a nightmare. The hedgerows limited visibility to a few meters. Tanks could not see beyond the next field. Infantry could not easily maneuver alongside them. Roads were narrow and predictable, making tanks vulnerable to ambush. German defenders understood this terrain perfectly. They placed anti-tank guns, Panzerfaust teams, and machine guns at likely crossings, waiting for Shermans to expose themselves. American tanks struggled immediately. To move from one field to another, a Sherman often had to climb the hedgerow, exposing its thin belly armor and turret ring. German gunners waited for this moment. A single shot at close range could destroy a tank instantly. Crews learned quickly that the hedgerows turned every advance into a trap. Tank losses were heavy in the first weeks. Crews watched Shermans burn at field crossings and road junctions. The sound of a penetrating hit, metal tearing, ammunition igniting, became terrifyingly familiar. Many crews bailed out under fire, scrambling into ditches or hedges, while German bullets snapped overhead. Survival depended on speed and luck. Adaptation followed fast. Tank crews and infantry learned to fight as a single unit. Infantry moved ahead of tanks, probing hedgerows for ambushes. Tanks provided suppressive fire, blasting openings in vegetation and buildings. Engineers improvised solutions, welding steel prongs, later known as Rhino tanks, to Sherman fronts, allowing them to punch through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. These modifications changed everything. Tanks could now burst through hedges unexpectedly, appearing in German positions without warning. Surprise shifted back to American hands. Combined with artillery and air support, armored advances became more effective. The hedgerows were still dangerous, but they were no longer impassable. Close-range combat defined Normandy armored fighting. Engagements often occurred at distances of tens of meters. Reaction time mattered more than range or armor thickness. Tank commanders had to spot threats instantly, while coordinating with infantry through shouted commands and hand signals. Radios were unreliable amid constant movement and noise. German anti-tank teams fought with determination. Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks could destroy Shermans at close range. Tank crews learned to scan constantly, firing machine guns into hedgerows to suppress hidden teams. Infantry protection became essential. A tank without infantry nearby was vulnerable and often doomed. Despite the danger, momentum slowly built. American armored units pushed through village after village, field after field. Every breakthrough was paid for, but each one weakened German defenses further. Tank crews gained confidence not in invincibility, but in their ability to adapt under pressure. Normandy taught American tankers that terrain could be as deadly as the enemy. It forced innovation, cooperation, and patience. Crews learned that success came not from speed alone, but from integration, armor, infantry, engineers, and artillery working together. By late July 1944, the breakout from Normandy began. The hedgerows loosened their grip. Open ground returned. For tank crews, the nightmare terrain that had defined their first European battles finally gave way to maneuver. But the war was far from over. The lessons of Normandy would follow them into France, Belgium, and eventually Germany itself, where the enemy would fight even harder as defeat approached. Breakout and pursuit. Racing across France. The breakout from Normandy transformed the war for American tank crews almost overnight. The hedgerows that had trapped armor and slow, deadly advances gave way to open roads and wide countryside. Suddenly, mobility mattered again. For the first time since North Africa, Shermans could maneuver, exploit speed, and strike deep into enemy territory. The war shifted from grinding attrition to rapid pursuit, and tank crews were at the center of it. After Operation Cobra cracked the German lines in late July 1944, American armored units surged forward. German defenses collapsed unevenly. Some units fought stubbornly. Others retreated in disarray. Roads filled with abandoned vehicles, artillery, and equipment. Prisoners were taken by the thousands. For tank crews, the pace was exhilarating and dangerous. Speed created new risks. Advancing rapidly meant outrunning supply lines. Fuel shortages became a constant threat. A tank without fuel was useless and vulnerable. Crews learned to scavenge from abandoned enemy vehicles and depots. Columns halted suddenly when gasoline ran dry. Mechanics worked frantically to keep tanks moving, often under fire. Ambushes remained deadly. German anti-tank teams set traps along narrow roads and in villages. A single Panzerfaust from a doorway could destroy a Sherman instantly. Tank commanders learned to move cautiously through towns, using infantry screens and suppressive fire. Machine guns swept windows, hedges, and tree lines continuously. Every corner was treated as a potential threat. Coordination improved with experience. Armored columns advanced with infantry riding on tanks when possible, dismounting quickly at the first sign of resistance. Artillery support was called rapidly to neutralize strong points. Air support, when available, devastated retreating German columns, turning roads into graveyards of metal and smoke. The pursuit across France was physically exhausting. Crews drove for hours, sometimes days, with little rest. Sleep came in short bursts beside tanks or inside them when possible. Dust coated everything. Engines overheated. Tracks wore down. Maintenance became a race against time. Crews knew that stopping too long allowed the enemy to regroup. Despite the speed, danger never disappeared. German counterattacks flared unexpectedly. Isolated enemy units fought fiercely from forests and villages. Mines destroyed tanks long after front lines had passed. Casualties continued, often when crews felt closest to victory. The randomness of loss haunted survivors. As American armor reached the Seine and then pushed toward Belgium, the sense grew that the war might end before winter. Paris was liberated. Crowds cheered advancing columns. For a moment, it felt as if momentum alone might carry American forces into Germany without pause. That illusion did not last. German forces stabilized behind rivers and prepared defenses. Supply shortages slowed advances. Fuel became critical. Tank crews waited as logistics caught up. The pause allowed the enemy to recover just enough to make the next phase of the war even more brutal. The race across France had proven what American armor could do when terrain and logistics aligned. It also revealed limits. Speed was powerful, but it could not replace preparation. As autumn approached, tank crews faced a different challenge. Fighting a desperate enemy in worsening weather, across rivers and fortified lines. The pursuit was over. The hard fighting was about to return. Into Germany, heavy armor and desperate resistance. As American armored units crossed into Germany in late 1944 and early 1945, the nature of tank warfare changed again. The pursuit across France had been fast and fluid. Germany was different. Here, resistance hardened. The enemy fought closer to home, with heavier weapons, better prepared defenses, and a determination sharpened by the knowledge that defeat meant the end of everything they had fought for. American tank crews now faced Germany's most dangerous armored threats in greater numbers. Panthers and Tigers appeared more frequently, positioned in defensive lines designed to exploit range and firepower. These German tanks could destroy a Sherman long before the Sherman's gun was effective. Open-field duels were rare and deadly. Tank commanders learned quickly that frontal engagements against heavy armor were suicidal. Instead, American doctrine emphasized combined arms more than ever. Tanks no longer advanced alone. Infantry cleared anti-tank teams. Artillery suppressed enemy gun positions. Smoke screens concealed movement. Air support, when weather allowed, struck armored concentrations. Victory depended on coordination, not individual tank battles. Terrain again worked against armor. Forests, villages, and narrow roads limited maneuver. Urban combat exposed tanks to close-range threats from buildings and basements. Panzerfaust teams waited until tanks passed, striking from behind or above. Shermans burned in city streets just as easily as they had in hedgerows. Crews adapted by advancing cautiously, firing constantly at suspected positions, and relying heavily on infantry screens. Winter compounded the danger. Snow and ice reduced traction. Engines struggled in cold weather. Visibility dropped. Crews fought with numb hands, breath-fogging vision ports, and exhaustion etched into every movement. Repairs took longer. Escape from a disabled tank became harder when hatches froze or debris blocked exits. German resistance became uneven but fierce. Some units surrendered quickly. Others fought to destruction. Hitler Youth units, Volkssturm militias, and remnants of regular army formations manned defensive lines. Experience varied wildly, but desperation compensated for lack of training. Anti-tank weapons were everywhere. The psychological toll increased. Tank crews entered Germany knowing they were advancing into the heart of the enemy. Civilian populations were present, often terrified, sometimes hostile, sometimes simply silent. Cities lay in ruins from bombing. The contrast between military objectives and civilian suffering was impossible to ignore. Casualties remained high. Even as victory approached, crews were killed by mines, ambushes, and artillery. Many later said this phase of the war felt more dangerous than earlier battles, not because the enemy was stronger, but because fatigue had accumulated and caution sometimes gave way to routine. Yet progress continued. American armor crossed rivers, breached defensive lines, and seized key cities. Each breakthrough weakened remaining resistance. German armored counterattacks failed due to lack of fuel, coordination, and air cover. The industrial base that had once supported German tank production was shattered. By March 1945, the Rhine had been crossed. Organized German armored resistance was collapsing rapidly. For American tank crews, the war's end was visible, but still uncertain. Experience had taught them never to assume safety until the last shot was fired. Inside their Shermans, crews continued to operate as they always had, communicating in shouts and signals, trusting each other completely, and moving forward despite fear. The tank remained both shield and threat, protection as long as it held, death if it failed. The push into Germany was not a victory parade, It was a final test of endurance against an enemy that refused to collapse quietly. And the last battles were still ahead. The Ardennes. Winter Trial of Armor. The winter of 1944 to 1945 became the harshest test American tank crews would face in Europe. As temperatures dropped and snow covered the forests of the Ardennes, German forces launched a final, desperate offensive aimed at splitting Allied lines and forcing a negotiated peace. For American armor, the Battle of the Bulge was not about speed or maneuver. It was about survival in conditions that punished every weakness. When the German attack began, many American units were resting or refitting. Tank crews were scattered, vehicles undergoing maintenance, fuel and ammunition stocks uneven. Snow and fog grounded air support. Roads turned to ice and mud. Visibility dropped to meters. German units moved through forests, striking weak points with tanks, infantry, and anti-tank guns. American tank crews were rushed into action piecemeal. Shermans moved along narrow forest roads where ambushes were almost guaranteed. Panzerfaust teams waited at close range. Mines littered approaches. German tanks used the terrain expertly, firing from concealed positions before withdrawing. A single hit could block a road, trapping entire columns. Cold became as dangerous as enemy fire. Engines struggled to start. Fuel lines froze. Oil thickened. Crewmen fought with numb hands, struggling to load ammunition or traverse turrets quickly. Inside the tank, breath condensed on metal surfaces, forming ice. Outside, snow and wind drained strength rapidly. Escape from a hit tank in these conditions could mean death by exposure even if enemy fire stopped. Logistics faltered. Fuel shortages immobilized tanks at critical moments. Crews abandoned vehicles they could not move, sometimes destroying them to prevent capture. Recovery under fire was often impossible. Mechanics worked in freezing conditions, hands bleeding, racing against both time and temperature. Despite these conditions, American tank crews adapted. They learned to use defensive positions effectively, covering road junctions and villages, rather than attempting open maneuvers. Tanks supported infantry in holding key terrain, firing from hull-down positions whenever possible. Artillery became crucial, compensating for limited visibility and mobility. The psychological strain was extreme. Crews knew that German forces were throwing everything they had left into the offensive. Every attack felt urgent. Every delay mattered. Tankers fought, knowing that if the line broke, the consequences could be severe. Sleep was rare. Crews rotated watches even inside tanks, weapons ready at all times. As the weather slowly cleared, air support returned. The balance shifted. German armored units, short on fuel and ammunition, became vulnerable. American tanks advanced cautiously, exploiting weakened resistance. Villages changed hands multiple times. Roads became graveyards of burned-out vehicles. By January 1945, the German offensive stalled and then collapsed. American tank crews had endured the worst winter conditions of the war and emerged intact as a fighting force. Losses were heavy, but the line held. The Ardennes had not broken American armor. It had hardened it further. For many tankers, the Bulge was the moment they realized the war would be won not by bold advances, but by endurance. Holding ground under unimaginable conditions mattered more than speed or firepower. The lessons learned in the frozen forests would carry them into Germany itself. The winter trial was over. The final advance awaited. Victory in sight. the last advance, and the end of the war. As winter loosened its grip in early 1945, American tank crews felt the war shifting beneath their tracks. The German offensive had failed. Fuel shortages crippled enemy armor. Air superiority returned decisively to the Allies. For the first time since Normandy, the path forward felt open. Yet no one believed the danger was over. Experience had taught tankers that the final miles could be the deadliest. The push east resumed with methodical force. Rivers that once seemed impassable were crossed under fire. Engineers built bridges while tanks covered them at close range. Smoke screens hid movements. Artillery suppressed likely ambush points. Crews advanced cautiously, aware that desperation sharpened the enemy's will. Isolated German units fought on from villages, forests, and industrial complexes, turning every approach into a risk. Urban combat intensified. Cities and towns became traps of rubble and narrow streets. Tanks advanced behind infantry screens, firing into windows and doorways to suppress Panzerfaust teams. Commanders limited exposure, keeping turrets buttoned when possible, and using machine guns relentlessly. Even so, losses continued. A single hidden launcher could end a crew in seconds. As American armor penetrated deeper into Germany, the war's human dimension became unavoidable. Civilians moved along roads with whatever they could carry. Cities bore the scars of bombardment. Tank crews passed forced labor camps and evidence of crimes that reframed the cost of the campaign. For many, these sites hardened resolve and gave meaning to months of attrition. The Rhine's crossing marked a psychological threshold. Once across, organized resistance unraveled quickly. German armored counterattacks lacked fuel, coordination, and air cover. Surrenders increased by the day. Columns of prisoners moved west under guard. Still, mines and stray artillery claimed lives without warning. Tank crews never assumed safety. They advanced as if every bend concealed a threat. Communication improved as the front stabilized. Units coordinated advances across broad fronts, sealing pockets of resistance. Tanks supported infantry in clearing strongpoints, while artillery and air strikes dismantled remaining defenses. The combined arms system, refined through years of hard lessons, worked as intended. Progress became steady and irreversible. By April, the end was unmistakable. Crews received orders that felt surreal. Hold positions, accept surrenders, avoid unnecessary engagements. The constant roar of engines and gunfire gave way to long stretches of silence. Men cleaned weapons out of habit. Tanks idled. The tension that had defined daily life ebbed slowly, unevenly. News of surrender reached units in fragments. Radio messages, briefings, word passed down the line. Reactions were subdued. Relief came first, deep and physical. Some crews climbed out of their tanks and sat on the ground, exhausted. Others laughed quietly or stared ahead, processing a reality they had not allowed themselves to imagine. For tank crews, the end of the war was not a triumphant parade through the streets. It was a stop, an abrupt halt after years of movement. Tanks that had carried them through deserts, hedgerows, forests, snow, and cities stood still. The men who had trusted steel and each other above all else faced a different task now, returning home. Demobilization began, but slowly. Crews guarded prisoners, assisted with occupation duties, and waited for orders. Friendships forged in fire-faced separation. Men who had survived together said goodbye with brief words and firm handshakes. There were no speeches that fit the moment. The last advance had ended not with a final charge, but with quiet acceptance. Victory was achieved. Survival had been earned. One chapter remains: what the tank crews carried forward and what their war left behind. Legacy of the American tank crew. The American tank crew of World War II left the war with a legacy shaped not by myths of invincible machines, but by hard-earned realism. They learned early that a tank was neither a guarantee of survival nor a symbol of dominance. It was a tool, powerful when used correctly, deadly when misused, and unforgiving when luck ran out. That understanding defined how American armor fought, adapted, and ultimately prevailed. The first legacy was combined arms. American tank crews proved that tanks alone do not win wars. Sherman succeeded not because they outmatched every enemy vehicle, but because they operated as part of a system. Infantry protected them from close-range threats. Artillery suppressed enemy guns. Engineers cleared routes and built bridges. Air power struck concentrations and disrupted counterattacks. This integration became doctrine, shaping modern armored warfare long after the war ended. The second legacy was reliability over perfection. The Sherman was not the most heavily armored or most powerful tank of the war, but it was dependable. It could be produced quickly, repaired in the field, and kept moving under harsh conditions. For crews, this meant replacements arrived when tanks were lost, and parts arrived when machines broke. The ability to sustain pressure mattered more than winning individual duels. The third legacy was crew cohesion. Tank warfare demanded absolute trust. 5 men operated inches apart, relying on each other's timing and judgment. A driver's mistake, a loader's hesitation, or a commander's misread could kill everyone. Crews that survived longest were those that communicated clearly, drilled relentlessly, and stayed calm under fire. This emphasis on teamwork became a hallmark of American armored units. The fourth legacy was adaptation under fire. From North Africa to Normandy, from the hedgerows to the Ardennes, tank crews learned and relearned how to fight. They modified tactics, equipment, and even their tanks to meet new threats. The Rhino devices in Normandy, improved coordination in urban combat, and defensive tactics in winter battles all emerged from frontline necessity rather than planning rooms. On a human level, the cost was permanent. Tank crews carried memories of burning vehicles, trapped comrades, and narrow escapes that never fully faded. Many veterans rarely spoke about these moments. Others shared fragments, often late in life. The tank, once a symbol of protection, became a reminder of how thin the margin between life and death had been. After the war, American tankers returned to a world. World War II reshaped the world we live in today. Its victories, losses, and lessons remind us of the cost of global conflict and the value of cooperation. By remembering this history, we honor those who lived through it and better understand the world they left behind. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.